Welcome back. This lecture is going to continue our study of the pre and early Middle Ages, as I have designated this particular time. We're getting closer to what many would say is the actual beginning of the Middle Ages, particularly with the first theologian we're going to be looking at here, Gregory the Great, and then moving into some of the other important early Middle Age theologians and those that influenced the philosophy and theology of the Middle Ages for more than 1,000 years. This particular lecture is actually going to be broken up into 3 shorter videos. And so let's get right to the first of these as we deal with the pre and early Middle Ages. This is the second lecture, and this is part 1 of this first lecture on these PowerPoint notes. All right, we're all set. Gregory the Great, also known as Gregory the First there. The Pope whose papacy, whose reign as Pope was generally considered to be the beginning of the medieval period. Gregory was born at about 540 AD to a wealthy and pious Roman family. We saw that that was also the case with one of our other previous individuals. About the age of 30, he was appointed urban prefect of Rome, and that's also something we've already seen, where he began his career in a government job, basically working for the government, but shortly afterward he resigned to devote himself to religious works. Gregory was given the title the Great for a number of reasons. At this particular time, the popes had become as much the political leaders of the city of Rome and had influence, obviously, beyond just the city of Rome to the western half of the Roman Empire, virtually. Gregory successfully navigated the city of Rome through famines and plagues, devoted a significant amount of resources to helping the poor, and even negotiated peace with the invading Lombards who invaded Italy and occupied northeast Italy thereafter. Gregory is considered one of the 4 great doctors of the church by the Roman Catholic tradition. The others would be Ambrose of Milan, Jerome, and Augustine, whom we have already looked into those 3 individuals. He's often, as we've said, considered by church historians the last church father, as well as the first medieval pope. One other incident not listed in the notes here is that he sponsored the first mission to the Saxons in Great Britain, and so he was also a very missionary-minded pope as well. As we've noted, he was born into an aristocratic family, spent most of his early life in a monastery where he received his education and spiritual training and traveled around the Mediterranean world, stayed for a time in Constantinople. So he was an individual that had a wider frame of reference than some of the other individuals that were going to be seen coming up in the Middle Ages. He wanted to have a life of scholarship and ascetic monk. He wanted to be something like what Jerome was pursuing, but was drafted by the people again as Pope in September of 590. His gifts as scholar, mediator, administrator, and spiritual advisor won him the position against his will, and we've seen that with Augustine, and we saw that with, in some respects, with Ambrose, and now we see it with Gregory the Great as well. Basically, called upon by the popular demand to take up a life within serving the church. Before he became bishop, we've already seen this. He was a key administrator of the city of Rome, eventually retired from politics, became a monk, dedicated his life to solitude, but was called out of monasticism by Pope Benedict and sent to Constantinople as the Pope's representative before the Byzantine Emperor. Later, Gregory returned to Rome and became a close advisor to Pope Pelagius, and not the same Pelagius that Augustine had opposed. And when Pelagius died, Gregory was appointed to the papacy and again accepted that role rather reluctantly. He, again, was elected to the papacy in 590, and thereafter, even though he didn't want the job, he was pretty prominent in increasing the power and authority of the role of the Pope. He firmly believed the Roman Pope was Peter's successor and therefore supreme head not just of the Western but of the Universal Church. And those in the East did not accept that position, and so we maybe see the beginnings of what is going to become the division between the East and the West. In numerous ecclesiastical disputes, he asserted the papacies, the Pope's supremacy over the whole church, and his efforts, while not always successful, at least paved the way for others to argue in that same vein. By the time he died, this particular office the power of that office had been greatly increased. During his tenure as Bishop of Rome, he provided a set of rules or guidelines for all of Western bishops, that is, all of those that were in positions of either pastoral or leadership as bishop. The Book of Pastoral Rule. He also launched a great missionary effort, as I've already said, to convert the pagan peoples of Britain and the Aryan barbarians of Europe. So he saw that the Aryans, the barbarians who had accepted Arianism, needed to be evangelized. You can see here that the anti-Aryan perspective had finally and fully won out in the West, and it was Gregory who wanted to see that imposed even upon the Aryan barbarian tribes of Eastern Europe. He built up monastic communities, gave to them charters to control vast areas of Europe for the purpose of establishing firm Christian strongholds or footholds without. He baptized Benedict of Nursia's monastic movement, and the rule of St. Benedict was made official for all of these monastic enclaves. He reigned as Pope over the Western Church for only 14 years, died in 604, but his impact was incalculable, really. And again, this is why he's called Gregory the Great. He left an indelible stamp of his own spiritual and theological preferences on Roman Catholicism for at least 1,000 years. As far as historical theology goes, the most important thing to note about Gregory is his major work, Moralia in Job, or commentary on the morals in Job, or something along that line. A very large work of 2,000 pages, almost, and no one had ever actually written a commentary like this on the book of Job before Gregory's time, so it was quite an achievement. It's impossible to appreciate Gregory's contribution to spirituality and theology without a proper understanding of the hermeneutical presuppositions that governed his reading of the scriptures, which he highlighted in this particular work. For Gregory, the Bible is a single book, deals with one major theme, Christ and the mysteries of the faith. So all of the Old Testament and its emphasis on the history of the nation of Israel should be read through the eyes of the New Testament and made to accommodate to that perspective. That's a perspective that more or less a number of theological traditions still hold today, but it doesn't quite take seriously the Old Testament in its own terms historically. Again, the hermeneutics of Gregory the Great, as divinely inspired writings, he held that the scriptures can appeal to readers on several levels. We've already seen this from some other theologians to this point. So that those that are just theological novices, those that aren't very well educated in the scriptures, at least not as much as those who have studied it for years, can still profit from reading from the Bible. Gregory uses a memorable simile to illustrate this point. The scriptures are, as it were, he says, a kind of river, both shallow and deep, wherein the lamb may walk, and yet the elephant can float. So just depends on where you happen to be entering the water at that particular time. An interesting metaphor. So the scriptures, again, have different levels of meaning. There is, in the first instance, the prima facie meaning of the text that he calls the historical sense. At least in principle, the historical and literal sense is the root or foundation for the more profound spiritual senses. So he recognizes you have to interpret it at least that way. Then there's the typological and allegorical, and then the tropological senses. The tropological sense is really more what we would call application, or the uses of the text. Although he acknowledges that the literal interpretation may not be possible in every instance, and recognizes that at some points there are figures of speech or intended sort of spiritual meanings, typological meanings. Hermeneutics of Gregory the Great distinguished again these three senses. Some passages are historical, some passages are allegorical, some passages discuss by means of allegory for their moral meaning. Again, that would be the tropological sense. And some, he says, finally I will investigate thoroughly in all three ways. So it depends on what the passage is about. Sometimes it's historical, sometimes it's allegorical, sometimes it's spiritual, sometimes there's just a moral lesson, but sometimes it's all three. Just depends on the passage, I guess. First, he says, I shall establish the historical sense as fundamental, and then erect on this foundation the typological sense. Again, that's a form of the spiritual sense. A mental edifice, stronghold of faith. So this is usually where we see things, he sees things in the scripture that apply more to Western Catholicism than to what might be in the literal context of an Old Testament book. And then by means of a moral sense, I shall, as it were, complete the building with a coat of paint. And so there's always the sort of moral or application of a particular text. So again, summarized there are those three senses, as we've seen. Gregory explains in the preface to his Moralia that Job can stand for the historical man Job, that's the literal sense. In the typological and allegorical sense, Job stands for Christ, as his sufferings point to the sufferings of Christ later on. And really for him, that's the meaning, that he says that's the proper way to understand the text of Job. That's the most significant meaning. This typological sense is closely associated then with the moral or tropological meaning, which Job, Gregory says, represents the church. You can see his method of interpretation is one that we might find a little odd, to say the least. The theological reason why the typical or allegorical or Christ-centered meaning and the tropological sense, what the text means for us and how we should live, the moral, the application, are so closely linked is that Christ is the head of the church and his body, and they forms an intimate union. So he sees no problem with making Job into a book about mostly about Christ and Christ's application for believers today, or in his day anyway. He also had some pastoral influence. Again, a different side of his character is seen in his pastoral and evangelistic concerns. He strongly believed the church must never lose sight of the spiritual need of individuals, so that's good. He vastly increased the benevolent work of the church, supported in large part by his careful administration of the vast estates. So his skill as an administrator that he had when he was over the city of Rome are now brought to bear in terms of his actually being a good administrator for the church. His practical book on pastoral care, we mentioned a moment ago, had an enormous influence for centuries. He exhibited a deep concern for evangelization. In 596, he commissioned Augustine of Canterbury, obviously not the same Augustine, to bring the Christian faith to England, and he also encouraged missionary efforts among Jews, although he rejected anything like forced conversions of the Jews. At the same time, his teachings included many elements that would become standard for the Roman Catholic Church, things like the sacrificial nature of the Mass and the doctrine of purgatory. So again, he had a very profound influence on not just the way that the church operated in pastoral fashion. Again, he was instrumental in again, missions or evangelistic efforts, but you can see that he also fostered some doctrines or ideas that were not necessarily grounded and weren't grounded in the Bible. All right, we're going to end this particular video, although, as I said, we will be picking it up right here for the second video. Same set of notes divided up into 3 videos. That was part 1, or video 1, and now we'll be getting ready for video 2.